outside of Melbourne came out of lockdown. Well, let's now bring in our politician panel, and we're joined by Nationals MP Darren Chester. We're also joined by Labor MP Josh Wilson. Welcome to you both. Darren Chester, if I could start with you. You know, regional Victoria opening up, but as we heard there, you've got a couple of Tier 1 and Tier 2 situations happening there in regional Victoria at this same time, leaving the regions vulnerable to this very transmissible variant. Is this really the time to be opening up?
Well, good morning, Fauzi. Good morning, Josh, and well done to the West Australians for the preliminary final last night. But keep in mind, mate, we want the grand final to come back to Victoria at some point. Now, just in relation to the question, absolutely now is the right time to be opening up our regional communities. The morale boost that our regional communities are getting from at least having some more freedoms returned to them in places where there has been no cases, and I acknowledge there's reports of one case in a regional location today. But towns like mine, where I am here in Lakes Entrance, right across Gippsland, right throughout the pandemic, there's very few cases whatsoever. And the morale boost that you get from allowing people to start actually having some of those interactions again. Obviously, we need to mask up, we do the physical distancing, and we're encouraging the vaccinations, but we have to give people hope, we have to give people a plan to where we can get to a position where more normal lifestyles and freedoms can resume. So right throughout regional Victoria, there's a lot of people now who are enjoying a few more freedoms today, but we've got to keep in mind that the risk of the pandemic is still there. We've got to keep making good decisions for ourselves and our families.
Josh, you're over the other side of the country in the land of COVID zero still. Are you concerned, though, that in Western Australia we are seeing lower vaccination rates there than compared to the rest of the country?
Well, good morning, Joe, Fauzi and Darren. Well, we want vaccination nationwide to move forward as quickly as possible. I think in terms of full vaccination, Western Australia is sitting at about 37%, and the national average is 41%. So, of course, we'd like to catch up to that. Excuse me. But part of the circumstances of being COVID-free, I think, means that there perhaps hasn't been the push along that there has been jurisdictions where you've had infections break out. So that is a factor. We are also constrained by vaccine supply. My daughters went out to the vaccine hub this week to get their Pfizer shots. They're both over 16, and there was a fairly significant group of older Australians who were essentially there at the vaccine hub, and this happens, as I understand it, from time to time, waiting out the day to see if there would be some excess Pfizer shots available at the end of the day that they could have access to. So I don't think it really helps to look at the Australian community and say, why aren't you doing better when essentially the national government hasn't done its bit to ensure that there's sufficient supply, and that continues to hold us back.
Vaccines is one thing, but that seems to be addressed now that we're getting more of a supply, more vaccine supplies in the country. The real concern now is whether our hospital systems, our health systems can actually cope with an increase in infection numbers. Darren Chester, in terms of regional hospitals and regional health systems, there's a real concern that these systems may be overwhelmed. What can be done to shore them up?
Well, I think it's a fair point you raise, and it points more broadly to the concern we have in our regional communities about access to health services more generally. So it's not a new problem for us in rural and regional communities. But what we are seeing in a lot of regional communities like mine here in Gippsland is very high take-ups of the vaccination. So we're seeing people coming forward and getting the jabs. We've been among the leaders in some of our regional communities. There has been a hesitancy that I think Josh referred to, and a level of complacency at some point where we had no COVID, so people weren't that interested in the vaccine. But once we started seeing those outbreaks in Sydney and in Melbourne, and the lockdowns were occurring, people became very keen to line up to get the AstraZeneca, the Pfizer, and now Moderna as well coming online, I think, from next week. So what we saw in the early days, I think it was 45 days for the first 1 million jabs. Now we're seeing 1 million vaccines every 4 or 5 days going to people's arms. So Australians see the vaccination as a pathway out. They see a plan now, a national plan, where if we get the vaccination rates up high enough, we'll have more freedoms. And I just encourage people to, if they've got some hesitancy, have a chat to their GP about it. Don't rely on Dr. Google or rely on what you read on Facebook. Have a chat to your GP about what suits you and what's best for your life and how you can get the vaccination safely.
Darren Chester, the supply of Pfizer is increasing, and that's in part from these swap deals that the government has struck with various countries. So we've received their Pfizer doses now, but we'll have to pay them back later. And a lot of people are asking questions about what that means for booster shots for the country when we reach that point. And the New South Wales Premier was asked about this during her press conference this week, and she said that she raised it a number of times during National Cabinet, and that the federal government has assured her that the supplies for boosters are certain. But how can we be sure of that and trust the government in saying that and guaranteeing that, given their record on vaccines? When we were at the beginning of this race with the vaccinations, the Prime Minister was not only saying it wasn't a race, but was saying incorrectly that Australia was at the front of the queue.
Well, there's a lot in that question which ended up being more of a statement, I think. The bottom line is Australians throughout this whole pandemic...
The question was, how can we trust this government?
Well, you can trust this government because Australians from the very outset of this pandemic have done an extraordinarily good job led by our national leadership, and primarily also through a good collaborative relationship through National Cabinet and our state leadership. We have kept Australians safe as a nation when other developed countries have had tens of thousands of deaths from this pandemic. Australians should be enormously proud of the fact that from the time the pandemic started, we have worked very constructively and collaboratively as leaders in the community to keep people safe. The fact that we've had less than 1,000 deaths in Australia, although every one of those deaths is tragic, is an incredible achievement when you look at other countries around the world and the rates of hospitalisation, the rates of deaths and the rates of contagion that occurred in those communities. So when I hear the Health Minister giving assurances around the swap deals and the fact that more Pfizer and other vaccines will be coming to Australia, I believe him because he's delivered them in the past.
Josh Wilson, are you just as confident that this government now has its procedures in place to ensure that Australia has enough booster shots going forward?
Well, it's hard to be confident based on past history, and that's the best guide. I mean, we know that the vaccine program was incompetently handled in various of its aspects. The access to supply is the biggest part, but we're still yet to see a really effective national information and vaccine promotion campaign. We talk about vaccine hesitancy. Here we are coming to the end of 2021 and we still haven't seen something like that. It's actually work that's being taken up by the private sector, whether it's Qantas advertising or Victoria Bitter or what have you. So we need that to be better. The difficulty for Australia currently is that the government, having mishandled that aspect of things, the vaccine rollout, is now seeking to lurch away from that, seeking to lurch towards the new plan or whatever they can deploy to put their past mishandling or incompetence in the rearview mirror. And there is a danger that we lurch into something else that is harmful, particularly perhaps in haste to come through this next phase, which is going to be very delicate, especially when you've got very significant outbreaks in the two largest states, outbreaks that the modelling we're relying on didn't use as foundation blocks for charting the way forward. And it's not right to say, I mean, nobody can say at the moment, oh, look, the vaccine supply has been fixed up, Moderna's here, there's more Pfizer. I mean, as I say, the reality around the country is that there's often not enough supply for those who want it. And we still don't even have the vaccination rates that we'd like to see in the most vulnerable groups. So that's the reality. Whatever Scott Morrison in the sort of the boasting and blaming game, whatever Scott Morrison wants to say, that is the reality.
All right, we want to move on to our next topic, and the world is marking 20 years since the September 11 terror attacks. Darren Chester, as a former Veterans Affairs Minister, how do you feel about the position that the world is on 20 years from September 11?
Look, everyone knows where they were when the attacks occurred. It was the day that I think our world's changed forever, and our peace and the freedoms we enjoyed were put under threat in a way that my generation had never seen before. So it was an extraordinary event in world history, and we'll be paying the price for those events for the rest of my lifetime. When you think about the security and safety of air travel, the changes we're prepared to accept as Australians to ensure our safety, that's an important change we've seen. And then you saw the conflict in Afghanistan. Australians deployed, 39,000 Australians deployed over a 20-year period, 41 lost their lives. And keep in mind, that conflict, the long tail of that conflict means that we will be supporting veterans from that conflict for the rest of this century. Just as World War II ended 76 years ago, we're quite rightly supporting veterans of World War II today, 76 years after that event. So we will be supporting our veterans, their families for a long time to come. I want to thank them for their service. They did an incredible job in the most difficult circumstances. They gave Afghanistan a chance at peace, and what that peace looks like now going forward, it's hard to really quite fathom at the moment, but they did some incredible work on our behalf in Afghanistan.
Josh Wilson, 20 years on, do you think the world is a safer place?
Very hard judgment to make. I mean, I start just by saying I endorse everything Darren has just said. He put it very well, and he's when he's had the responsibility of undertaking that work on behalf of Australian veterans, he's performed excellently, and I completely agree with those reflections. It is an opportunity. It's interesting that we mark the anniversary today, but to some degree, the sort of the 20-year passage of time has been preempted by events in Afghanistan. And while we look back to that event, which, as Darren said, was literally unbelievable, and there was a kind of a terrorist act, the likes of which we had never seen and mercifully have not seen since, in its sophistication, in its audacity and its outrageousness. But it's right too that 20 years on we reflect on what it meant and how we responded, and to some degree in Afghanistan we are back to where we began, and we need to be able to look at those events and, just as importantly, our response, and ask ourselves whether there were some decisions that were taken and some outcomes that followed that didn't make sense and that weren't helpful. There's a lot of harm that occurred on the day. If you think about Afghanistan alone, for the United States, 2,500 service people. For ourselves, we lost 41 service people, many more injured. For the United States, $10 trillion. For us, $10 billion. And of course, in Afghanistan itself, 150,000 lives lost, including 50,000 civilians.
Yeah. On that note, we're going to have to end this chat, but we thank you both for joining us on Weekend Breakfast, Darren Chester and Josh Wilson. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Stay safe.